Had a little,
Oops.
had a little trouble finding the right website again, but anyway, my apologies.
Okay, we'll move on to item number 3, which is an update from Sally on the new regulations that were finally released late on a Friday afternoon from the Ministry of the Environment. Sally, could you go ahead, please?
Can you confirm that everybody can see my screen?
I can see your screen.
Great. Okay. So yes, starting back in 2019 and last year, we had various amendments made to the Conservation Authorities Act. And of course, we've been waiting since those amendments were made for the regulations. Earlier this year, a working group was established by the province, largely comprised of CA reps. And so they helped guide some of the discussions around or the text in the draft regulations. So there was this consultation document that was published in May. And so further comments were provided by ourselves as well, largely having to do about concerns about, at that time, they were proposing that no recreational uses of conservation areas would be permitted to be recoverable through the levy. So you may recall that. So that was that consultation document that gave us concerns around that. And in the event, they have now just recently published 3 regulations where that and other matters are addressed. So they're focused in 3 areas, defining what is a mandatory program and service, setting out how we're going to move forward in terms of what they're calling cost apportionment agreements. And then lastly, the rules of conduct in conservation areas. Historically, every CA had its own regulation, and this one effectively just consolidates it all. So I don't actually address it here because no matters of substance have changed. So getting into what's the mandatory programs and services. So the first thing is that they spell out for us that the timelines have changed because of the repeated delays in the regs coming out. We now have until January 1st, 2024. So the 2024 budget to figure these things out, which for us is a full 2 years. The reason why it's 2024 is because some CAs have significantly different budget cycles. And so in order to give them a full year to be able to navigate this, that's why this date was pushed back so much. So the transition plan that we need to produce is comprised of 2 phases. The first phase is to clearly lay out our programs and services, what is covered by the Act or the new regs as mandatory and not, and then the costing for what is mandatory and what is not. So, so that everybody has a clear picture of the scope of services we deliver and what's covered and what would be subject to discussions under these cost apportionment agreements. And then there is this 2-year window where we need to implement this transition plan, and there's various reporting points where we have to check in with the ministry to let them know how we're proceeding. So let's get into the meat of what's mandatory and what's not. So by and large, what was mandatory under or fundable, I'll call it under the former Section 39 of the Conservation Authority Act, that's that annual transfer we get from the province, which is in the order of, I think it's 120 or 180 these days, but in any event, it's not a whole lot of money. But so it largely aligns with that, but there are now key exclusions that we need to note and key inclusions. So the exclusions of note are what we were talking about in terms of passive recreational use. So the province heard CAs and CA users in terms of, well, please fund the trails, the parking lots, the outhouses, that sort of thing. But the province has clearly come down in terms of anything that's not of a passive recreational use, it will no longer be eligible for the municipal levy. So for us, this is all the major structures we have at the Milliken Tail, for example. So the gatehouse, the museum building, and the contents of the museum in those buildings, and any programs run out of those buildings. That would also include the education center. So key inclusions are things that have been previously subject to MOUs between CAs and the province. So it is now mandatory that we implement the province's surface and groundwater programs, no longer subject to an MOU. It is mandatory that we deliver the source water protection program. And I flagged this one because it is not clear that for all years going forward that we will be receiving any sort of money from the province for that. So currently we are, but there's certainly nothing in regulations that says that the province will continue to do that. And then lastly, we also had an MOU for delegated authorities under the plan. I guess it is under the Planning Act to comment on behalf of the province for compliance with its policies as they relate to natural hazards. So those functions that were previously subject to MOUs are now in regulation, and they are all fundable off of the municipal levy. So in terms of non-mandatory programs and services that a municipality can deliver, and this is the language in the regulation. So this is largely relating to those services that we provide to municipalities, primarily where they don't have that area of expertise on staff, or they're not delivering that service. And so specifically, the municipalities are obligated to comply with the provincial policy statement, but they may not have the staff to deliver these analyses of applications as they come in. So the areas where we may enter into these agreements with municipalities relate to primarily these three things here: natural heritage reviews, hydrogeological reviews, and stormwater management reviews. So there's nothing saying we have to. It's a function of whether or not a municipality has that resource or wants to contract it out to the CA or others. So we currently have an MOU with both the County of Lanark and the city. And what we're not certain about going forward is with respect to the County of Lanark one, whether or not we'll be able to engage in a contract at the county level again, or whether we'll have to do individual agreements with each of the member municipalities of the county. And then the last category are other programs and services, which can be delivered only if there are these cost apportionment agreements or some other revenue source, or foundation or other sorts of grants and programs. So the key one that I just wanted to highlight today, because of course it's a matter of discussion, is our stewardship program. So other key requirements set out in the regs are that all CAs are now to have these plans or strategies or inventories. And I'm happy to say that largely, in the past 3 years or more, MVCA has made progress on a lot of these. So we're not starting at ground zero. That several of these are already showing up in our interim financial plan, that 3-year priority document that the board approved last year, as well as our 10-year capital plan in terms of some of the analysis or these studies associated that would be instructive in preparing these plans. So I think we're in a good place. The one area that we've not done any work, to my knowledge, is the first one, actually, ice management plan, but that has been an area that certainly the Director of Water Resources Engineering and I have spoken about and know that it's a gap that we need to address. So key dates going forward is that by the end of this year, we need to develop a transition plan that we can and issue it to the member municipalities. It just sets out the approach that's going to be taken. Then by the end of February, we have to complete that categorization and costing. By January of the 2024, all those cost apportioning agreements need to be in place, and that would inform our 2024 budget. And then by the end of 2024, we have to complete those 6 mandatory elements I just spoke of. So in terms of immediate next steps, we're going to be working on the transition plan, and I'm proposing to table it at the December 1st board meeting so that we can review it together and issue it to member municipalities. And then in Q1 of next year, we'll be completing that inventory and costing. and I'll table it at the AGM. And again, we'll adjust as needed so that it's completed by the end of February. And that's it. So I'll stop sharing and happy to answer any questions.
Have any questions? Please raise your hand. Go ahead, Phil. You're on mute, Phil. I can't see your mouth, but your eyes tell me you're speaking.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. I just wanted to comment that your presentation was more audible today. It didn't seem to be wavering as much as it was at the last meeting, so I don't know if you got a new microphone or got closer to it. Thank you.
Any other questions for Sally on that report? Again, it's a lot to digest. Seeing none, no. We'll consider the report received. Thanks, Sally, for that update. Next, we're going to move on to the items that have been brought forward by from the Finance and Administration Committee. The first is a workforce plan and its report and a presentation from Sally. Go ahead, Sally.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen again.
Oh, one thing I forgot to do at the start of the meeting was give people an opportunity to declare any conflicts of interest. You can do that now that we're into the meat and potatoes and the voting, the motions. You can do that now, or you can raise it at the whenever a motion is put forward for the rest of the meeting. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Sally.
Okay, so everybody can see that all right?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so
Yes.
so as you'll recall, earlier this year, I received direction to develop the equivalent of a workforce plan dealing with workload issues and with succession planning and the like. And in the interim, we did a survey of staff. It was a third party, did a psychosocial assessment, and staff were surveyed. And this is just a snapshot of one of the key findings having to do with resourcing and staffing at the organization. So you can see that we do have some significant challenges. We don't have adequate staffing. It is impacting staff stress levels and morale. We do have issues around corporate resiliency where we don't have a lot of depth in some areas and therefore we're vulnerable as an organization. And just generally within the work environment, we want to create a space that's desirable workplace and that where we are able to offer competitive wages and benefits. And so some of the issues that we're dealing with in terms of workload drivers are the following. We do need to manage risk. And so we are implementing a fairly aggressive asset management plan, our 10-year capital plan. We're also developing a watershed model that is going to enable us to assess how the impacts of climate change are going to affect this watershed and what actions we need to be taking either on the asset side or the operational side or on the regulatory side. And on that last piece, we need to be updating our floodplain mapping on a regular basis to reflect changes on the landscape as development occurs in the watershed. We've also been responding to a terrific demand in terms of land development and growth pressures, as well as the impacts of the 2017 and 2019 floods and reconstruction activities. And as I've mentioned on previous occasions, more and more of these applications are increasingly complex because all of the easy developable land has already been developed by and large. And therefore, what we're left with are more marginal type properties or properties that are subject to environmental impact statements of some form. And so these applications are more complex and require more time to review and assess. And then lastly, unfortunately, we've also seen, and this is not just us, but other CAs and quite frankly, municipalities, I imagine if you speak to your staff, you may find similar feedback on this, is that I think that because there is such an incredible push on development right now, the submission quality we're getting is not as good as historically we've experienced. And therefore there's a heck of a lot more to and fro between ourselves and the applicants or their consultants trying to get the complete information needed to assess these applications. So all of that is pushing the demand on the planning and engineering approval side of things. So then lastly, of course, there's been all this work associated with the legislative and regulatory and funding changes. So we did experience that 50% drop in provincial funding back in 2019. And so retroactively, we had to find the money that was removed from our annual budget that year. And that was equivalent to roughly 1.5 FTE, which is a full-time equivalent employee. And then there's all the complications around the defunding of the museum, which has proven out to be the case. They had indicated that was going to be the case, and now in regulation, it is the case. So there's been a whole lot of work around that. And one of the reports in your agenda package is the update regarding the efforts being made around the museum and transitioning it to the future financial model. And then lastly, work completed, but work yet to come around these whole transition plans. I said MOUs, but they're now going to be CAAs. And all that work is going to continue to work to add to workload pressures. So on this one, you see current payroll distribution and between full-time and part-time casual staff, between permanent and contract, and then the kind of vacancies in our total FTE complement. So right now we have roughly 33.33 employees on staff, or including vacancies. And this is the end state where we'd like to go. So I'm going to walk you through what the asks are and the rationale behind them. So I'm going to start with the yellow. The yellow I refer to as delete creates. It's a term given when you transition an FTE from one purpose to another purpose. So it has generally negligible impact on the budget, depending on whether the new and old FTE job descriptions are on the same job classification or something different. But by and large, they have minimal impact on budget. So the first one is that we don't have any redundancy or very limited redundancy to our treasurer. And near and dear to all the staff is the fact that our treasurer does payroll. So, amongst many other things, we rely on her to get revenues as well. She's the one that invoices and makes sure that we pay our invoices. So we're looking to create a financial assistant. And then down the road, depending on all that happens with the museum, we're looking to create a community liaison position, because we do take bookings at the Milliken Tail. We rent out the gatehouse, we rent out the cloister. There's a fee in the bylaw amendment that you're going to be looking at today that looks to rent out the education center. So that kind of function continues to be needed. As well, we will have communication and volunteer work that we will want to do with the community, because I think that as this whole financial model changes, the role of volunteers in delivering certain programs at that site will become more, not just that site, but across the organization will become more important. And so having a community liaison person who could do that volunteer coordination work, because it's important to have it coordinated to do it well. And then lastly, for that person to work with the foundation, because currently the foundation has no staff, and this is an issue for the foundation. We've had very limited resources we've been able to dedicate to that. So that's what that position could do as well. So the third yellow box is we're proposing to have another water resource engineer. And the reason for this is simply because of the volume of capital works primarily that we need to be dealing with over the next 10 years. When the board approved the 10-year capital plan, which was wonderful, and I thank everybody for that, we didn't also provide the resources needed to actually implement it from a staffing perspective. And so this has been a very challenging year for us to be moving forward on some of the capital projects with people in positions who have been largely historically simply focused or primarily focused on either operational matters of the watershed or on the permit and planning approvals process. So that's what that additional resource is required for. So now I'm going to delve into the orange boxes, which are new positions. And the new positions, if they're hatched, it's because we're proposing they be 50% funded. So, and I'll start to explain that. The summer students, by and large, we can get funding for, you know, to a significant degree. So I think it's not unreasonable for us to budget for some and assume that at least half of them will get funded. So that's the rationale for those various summer student positions. And we rely on them in part to backfill for staff, to enable staff to take summer vacation. And you will have read perhaps in the report that staff having the wherewithal to take vacation and not feel stressed in advance of or dealing with huge volumes of work after the fact is a big issue at MBCA. So it is important to us not only to deliver on some of the summer programming we run, but as importantly, or more importantly, to enable full-time staff to take their vacations. So the other hatched ones that I wanted to draw your attention to are the engineer in training and the junior planner. So these two positions are often probably going to be focused on special projects approved by the board under either our 10-year capital plan or that interim financial plan. So our 3-year priority type projects. Now, a lot of those should be eligible for some sort of funding or will be subject to some sort of MOU or the cost apportionment, the cost apportionment agreements. So we're fairly confident that if we can provide our 50% as a corporation, that we will be able to successfully find dollar matching from one of those other sources. So the last thing I wanted to draw your attention to, or second last, I guess, on here are the green boxes or hatched green. These positions are also heavily influenced by demand and demand for primarily planning and regulation services. And because they're volume-based, I'm proposing that they be cost recoverable. So you will have seen in the workforce plan that once these regulations are in place and our apportionment agreements in place, that we conduct a fee study in partnership with Rideau Valley Conservation Authority and South Nation Authority. And that one of the principles of that be that the authorities cost recover for these volume-based positions, because we wouldn't have them as part of our staff complement unless we were dealing with the kind of planning approval volumes that we are as an organization. I've already started to have that discussion with my colleagues at the other CAs, and we'll have more conversations about this, obviously, before we pursue that fee study. So lastly, the GIS specialist position is one that is not 100% funded right now. And it is, in my view, especially in the context of the new regulations, core to our activities and should be 100% funded by the municipal levy. And so I'm proposing that it transition to the levy, as is the other 50% of the engineering training. That person as well will be focused on core activities. And therefore we need to be looking at transferring that onto the levy. The outlines of with the red are positions that haven't undergone a job evaluation and market assessment in many years, and therefore should be assessed in the next couple of years. So in terms of proposed adjustments, we're looking at an additional net 3.33 more positions. So it's the one permanent position that would report into me, and I say permanent and then it's year round, it's not summer student. And I failed to speak to that one specifically, but with all these change projects happening and additional reporting requirements and the like, we need to have a resource simply to help work with me and the management team and staff on these transition elements. And so I view that additional FTE as somebody who's focused primarily on these change pieces, so that the rest of us aren't doing it off the corner of our desk, which is extremely difficult when people are already resourced and you want to implement change initiatives. You have to resource those change initiatives. And that's, I felt the most efficient way to do it would be with a student reporting into me that rotates every 4 months. I give them a set number of projects to work on, and then we implement. So this is just to give you a sense of some of the other items that are recommended in the document before you. There are a whole host of other things we need to be doing associated with the psychosocial issues in the workplace. And I will be coming back to the executive and the board on that. And included within that is some of the supervisor and management training that is needed within the organization that will start happening next year. I speak to in the document the opportunity for shared services. So for instance, I was just on the phone yesterday with my colleague from South Nation about health and safety coordinator services that they might provide to us. The document speaks as well to any number of services that we're providing to or obtaining from other CAs. It's a very important way that CAs going forward today and going forward will be able to afford this full scope of services that we have to deliver. So I won't go down through all of this. You can see the fee study showing up in 2023. We might want to revisit this because this was developed literally and issued the day that that the new regs came out. So I might want to revisit a bit of this as more details and guidance comes from the province. But notionally, this is the scope of work that's recommended under the workforce, and some of which requires budget and some of which does not. So obviously, the benefits of implementing the workforce plan as recommended is improved workload balance and resiliency, opportunities for advancement. And this is another item that I'd just like to raise. Historically, to a significant degree, it's been the summer students that we've had that have come into the junior positions that we train up and go into the more senior positions within the organization. And I think that has worked well historically. And so it's another added value of adding in these summer student positions. Obviously, better relations and morale in the office, and improve match between the work people are doing and their JDs and what they're getting compensated and their competitiveness, the greater work environment, and will allow us to deliver on those priority risk projects. Because right now, it's been very, very challenging to make progress on some of those projects. A lot of extra hours work, and I think that shows up in one of the tables in the workforce plan there about the amount of overtime that has been put in the past year, and also reduced risk of errors, sick leave, our reputational risk, and our corporate liabilities. I mean, ensuring that the work is appropriately allocated and people have the time and resources needed to do them, I think is critical. So the last slide I just wanted to share with you is the phased implementation. And this was the subject of discussion at the Finance and Admin Committee meeting. You'll see the second last line, this municipal levy and the percentage to be implemented or phased in over time differs from the report that was circulated. It was the recommendation of the committee that this table be amended to accelerate the rate on which these additional costs are placed onto the levy. So I wanted to draw this to your attention since it wasn't in the version of the report issued to you. And do I have another slide? Yes. So in terms of, the amount that's the net impact, I did want to go back to show you this. You can see that by 2024, when we're doing enhanced fee recovery, the actual impact on the levy decreases on over time. So while the amount going on the levy will increase over time, the actual dollar amount will decrease in time, assuming we're able to do greater cost recovery. 2022, there are some special project costs that need to be captured, and that's why it's higher at 348. But then once those projects are completed in 2023, the costs drop, and then again in 2024, when we're able to do cost recovery. I see that Councillor Eli El-Shantiri has a question. Did you have it on this table, Councillor?
No, I'm just going to wait till you're finished. Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of impacts on the operating reserve, our projected year-end balance for this year is 924,000 roughly, and that constitutes approximately 34.5 of our annual operating budget, which equates roughly to 4 months operating budget. If we were to withdraw 261, I'm just wondering, did I update that? 233. No, I didn't update that, or I didn't pull up the correct slide. So the bottom line is we dropped below, sorry, let me just go back. Our operating reserve, 261, right, okay. So under the previous scenario, and I apologize that my slide wasn't updated. Under the previous scenario, if this was a 25% withdrawal against the municipal levy and the balance on the operating reserve, it would have equated to 261 withdrawal, which would reduce our balance to 663 or 3 months cash flow. By putting more onto the levy, whoops. So you can see instead of 261, it drops down to 233. We would be more in line with it above. We'd have a healthier amount of operating budget left in our reserve. We wouldn't be right at the 3 month mark. So that is, an additional advantage of increasing the phasing onto the municipal levy. It puts less pressure on our operating reserve and allows us to have a full and healthy 3 months operating budget. So depending on what our surpluses or our deficits are in 22 and 23, the pressure on the operating reserve, it could potentially drop below that 3 month recommended amount. Now, to be clear, we don't actually have a policy regarding the balance in the operating reserve. I think we should. I think we need policy around what is a healthy reserve balance. So I just put that out there for discussion. And I do believe that is my last slide. So I'll stop sharing unless somebody, Councillor El-Shantiri, do you want any of these slides up for discussion purposes?
I'm not sure if no, because the chair will not be able to see everybody. I think I memorized where I need to go.
Okay.
No,
Go ahead,
thank
Eli.
you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So Sally, obviously, this is a lot of work's been done to get where we are, and is quite a bit to digest, I'll be honest with you. If I can start backward, policy on a reserve, yes, we should have a policy on reserve. Operating for 3 or 4 months, in my humble opinion, after what we saw in the pandemic, I don't think that's sufficient anymore. We need to rethink, what is the proper amount. I know we are a creature of the municipality and majority of your funds coming from the municipality, but it's good to have a plan in place where if something to happen, at least, if I reach that threshold, I'm gonna go to the municipality. So the municipality need to know what is your policy about this. Did I get this right, or I'm off the top?
No, I agree with you 100%. I mean, at minimum, we need a policy. I think we might want to get some counsel on that from our auditor on what would be an appropriate balance for our organization.
Okay, Mr. Chair, if I may continue.
Go ahead.
The other issue, Sally, and it's not just our organization, I think most organization, the pandemic has changed the whole dynamic of how we do business. It's additional cost, there's a greater learning. I know going through the pandemic within the city, the extra hardware we have to spend, the extra arrangement to make sure people can do their job from home, and all that, we never thought about it in the past, but there's no longer you can ignore it. So are you in a position to tell us, look, you know, our staff, if something happened, we're still going to be able to continue to do what we're doing, but we need that extra envelope of something, because there's some job you have to have people on the ground, but there's some job we know you can do them remotely. But do we have the budget? Do we have the foreseen budget for the hardware for those individuals to be able to be successfully working from home?
So the budget estimates that we put before you, for example, for the new FTEs, where it's appropriate, we have identified additional hardware. So that is included in the cost before you. In terms of transitioning a workforce that historically worked on site to a workforce that can work remotely, we believe we can manage through our IT replacement program, which is that, you know, over time we will transition the type of hardware, but there are other types of issues that regarding connectivity and simply the ability of some staff to make stable connections that, you know, are quite frankly outside our control. But I guess in short, in answer to your question, I feel comfortable that the resources that are proposed in front of you will provide for this changed work environment.
And my other question is, Sally, and I always, not just in this board, but even at the city as a whole, the unfunded liability towards staff retirements. And I know I sound like a broken record about this because I ask that question every time, because that's so important to be able to say, yes, we have, you know, we have enough funding for that transition, and if it's to happen, we have funding to fund it if this is to happen. Those are really important. As much as it is important to know, you might need to start thinking a 3 or 4 month reserve budget to operate. Maybe it's not enough anymore. Maybe you need 6 months, maybe a little longer. But I hope the executive are taking notes, and I'm not suggesting you should, you know, share the load yourself, but maybe we can have a subgroup working together with you, the senior management team, to be able to help you from the board perspective and also from staff. What is the need anymore? Because our organization is growing, and if anything, the pandemic taught us we need to be prepared. If anything, we need to be prepared. So anyway, you've done a great job. It's a lot of work, a lot of obviously a lot of to digest on it, but I have to say we need to inject to it is the new norm now, which is what we learned in the last couple of years, and hopefully it will never happen again under our lifetime, but you know, something can never be too prepared sometimes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Eli. I see John Carreau and Janet Mason with their hands up. After you two have asked your questions of Sally, I'm going to move to the motion, and then we can carry on with the discussion. So go ahead, John.
Thanks, Chair. Sally, I'm interested to know what exposure staff have had to the workforce plan. And the reason I ask that is I think it's been described as one of the better ways to improve morale and to, in fact, give staff a better sense of being invested in and that they've been heard. So that's my question to you.
So when it was distributed 2 weeks ago, I believe 2 weeks ago today, perhaps, to all staff. So all staff have had access to this. And in fact, you know, some one-on-one conversations have been happening between their managers and staff and follow-up as well as at some unit meetings. So, and more discussion is going to be underway going forward, particularly in terms of the outcome of the psychosocial survey that I referenced in the document. So we've developed an action plan around that, and we'll be having sessions in follow-up to discuss those in more detail. So in short, yes, the staff have absolutely seen this workforce plan, and you may observe that several of them are on the call today because they're very much interested in hearing the board discussion on this.
And just one supplemental question, and it has to do with the community liaison position. But I think I'll mention it now, but I'll come back to it when we talk about the Nature Smart Climate Solution Fund, because I'll mention the question, but we can defer the response to it. It's probably better dealt with together. It really has to do with whether or not we do have the right kind of staff capability to deal with the kind of funding that we really also need through the MVCA fund, but also perhaps in support of the Mill of Kintail. And I'll leave it at that. So I'm concerned about whether or not we've really addressed that as what I consider to be an essential skill set. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Go ahead, Janet.
I just wanted to make an observation that I think what the workforce plan says at a high level is that we have been understaffed for at least some period of time, and that this is in recognition of the workload that staff has been undergoing, you know, particularly in the last few years. I don't think it's just due to COVID. I do think that what your plan says is that we have been understaffed. And it's a recognition that we need roughly 3 1/3 more people. I'm for sure we could do with even more, but this is a prudent way of going about it for now. And I would also say that as we learn more through transition, the transition plan, that I'm sure we're going to need to revisit the plan. And but I certainly support the fact that we need more people to make sure that our staff are not overworked, are not stressed out because they can't accommodate all the work that's coming in from all the activities that are occurring. So thank you for putting it together.
Thanks, Janet. I'm going to move on to the motion before we continue the discussion on the report. Could I have the motion before us is resolve that the board receive the workplace plan attached to the staff report 3168/21, and that the board adjust the 2022 operating budget assumptions to increase municipal levy in the amount as prescribed by table 2 as presented to provide for workforce adjustments.
So I move.
Moved by Councillor El-Shantari, seconded by Krista Lowry. Okay, we have the motion before us. Is there any more discussion on that motion?
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Go ahead, Eli.
I did recommend it to the GM to have whether between the executive and the executive of the board and the senior staff to have some kind of working group or get together at some point and share some. I think Janet makes a good point. It's not so much is the pandemic create the pressure. We also had a pressure before, but unless we have a better understanding what is the need out there, because sometimes, I'll be honest, we hear across the province, oh, well, and you know, a conservation authority taking on so many items they shouldn't be taken on or take it. So if we can peel that onions one layer, so we can have a better understanding what you are talking about is we must have enough, or we must have proper staff and or workforce to be able to do this work, not just is a luxury. So I'm not sure if I'm making sense to you, but I hear from my colleague on AMO, they have the same concern. You know, well, you know, just focus on your conservation job, and they are. I mean, to be honest with you, I know how the city of Ottawa, how busy we are and how much we're behind, because we want the expert like your people is to be answered that. So I think to have an understanding or as a follow-up, if you don't mind, of what we present today. You know, we met together, we think this is how we think we need, why we need what we need. That's what I'm looking for, if that can be clarified.
I think it can, Eli. I know in the next little while, I'll be engaging the executive committee with respect to that the psychosocial analysis that was done and the staff response to it, and we can certainly include that in that discussion as we move forward, working with the executive committee and maybe touching on the management team as well. Because it is, I agree, it's a serious matter that needs to be addressed. It's not just the short staff, it's all of the other pressures that have landed on our staff at the same time, and not having the capacity to do the basics through being short staffed also diminishes your capacity to cope with the stresses of that change. And that's really what we're seeing going on. And so I hear you. And I think that's something that we can take up with the executive and senior management.
Thank you so much, Chair.
Is there any other discussion to the motion or comments? Okay, all in favor of the motion? Oh, Phil, I see your hand, and then John.
Just a quick comment. I've always been impressed with how dedicated staff have been to deal with the excessive workload and to come up with innovative solutions and so on. The thing that would concern me is the part in the thing that says, does MBCA work interfere with your home life? It shouldn't, but I'll tell you from a practical point of being in business and working at things, probably each day it does, whether you're a good teacher or a good engineer or whatever. Anyway, I'm saying this, recognize that kind of thing is going to happen, but I think, as I would say to staff, don't be afraid then to make up for it and take your daughter out to a hockey game or something like that, and on company when you say, well, don't feel guilty about leaving work early or giving them a ride home when they need it. Make up for it. Work will inevitably interfere with what's happening, but stand up to the general manager and say, I ordered this. Thank you.
Insurrectionist. John Inglis, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, this is a pretty comprehensive document, very detailed, and I guess Janet summarized it: 3 1/3 new FTE. We understand where the pressures are coming from, not just COVID and so on. But bottom line, what should I give my council a heads up that the percentage increase might be during 2022 and 2023 for the municipal levy? I didn't follow all the numbers completely. Can you just summarize that for me, Sally?
Actually, Ange has those numbers, I hope, at her fingertips, because we did calculate out what the pressure would be for each municipality. And I should let the members from Ottawa know, because of the significant amount they pay. I've already shared that data with Steve Willis. And
I don't need the differentials. I don't need the differential split, just the sort of the aggregate percentage increase as a rough guide.
Okay, I'm going to defer it over again to Ange, because she does have all the numbers in front of her.
Are you ready with those, Ange, or can you just send John an email?
I can just send an email. I know for North Frontenac,
Mm.
I didn't calculate percentages, John, but I did North Frontenac, it would mean $1,076 for this workforce plan hit to you. So I'll calculate out your percentage and send it to you in an email.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Phil, Paul, I saw your hand up. Were you wanting to speak, or were you voting on the motion?
I was voting.
You were voting? Okay. Okay, so we have the motion in front of us. All in favor of the motion. Do I need to read it again? No, apparently not. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, the motion is carried. Thanks, everyone. That was a long presentation, but it was an important discussion to have. The next item on the agenda is our 2022 budget assumptions. And this is report 316721. It's on page 54 of your agenda package. Sally, go ahead.
And
Can you make this one brief?
yep, I will.
Okay.
So I'm just pulling it up here in front of myself as well. So the bottom line is that because of the significant amount of funding we received from the city of Ottawa, the historical practice has always been to look to the city for the high level increments and direction that are given to staff. And so the direction given to staff earlier this year at the City of Ottawa was to allow for an assumed growth rate in the tax base of 1.4%. And so we've carried that forward. They had a 3% increase in the overall levy. And that is the amount that we've applied to our operating budget. As well as in this document here, you will have seen we are now adding to that which you just approved through the previous report. And then lastly, that the capital budget levy increased by 4.5%. And that's in line with the 10-year capital plan that the board approved the update of last year. And all of this has already been communicated to the City of Ottawa. And I asked that if they had any concerns that they let me know before today, and I have not heard back anything of concern from them.
Thanks, Sally. I'm going to move straight to the motion on this before any discussion. So the motion is resolved that the Board of Directors directs staff to develop the 2022 budget and related documents in accordance with the following parameters. 1, an assumed growth in tax assessment of 1.4%. 2, a municipal levy increase of 3% to the operating budget, as well as the amount prescribed in Table 2 of the Workforce Plan Staff Report. And 3, a municipal levy increase of 4.5% to the capital budget. Could I have a mover for that motion, please? Kirby Thompson, seconded by Paul Kehoe. Janet, go ahead.
Just a small point in that the table 2, you put table 2 as presented in the previous motion, because the table 2 that's in our report is the wrong table, right? It has the lower percentages.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make the comment that the
Motion.
motion may need to be
Yeah.
amended.
Friendly amendment.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other comments? Questions? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please raise your hands. That is carried. Next, we have the 2022 fee schedule update report, and we have a presentation from Matt Craig and Ange Miller. Take it away, Matt.
Okay, thank you. I'll be brief.
Thank you.
I'll address schedules A to C, and Angela can address any questions with schedule D. So traditionally, the fee schedule is presented to the board for approval prior to budget discussion. We discuss any increases with the South Nation and the Rideau Valley Conservation Authorities just to ensure consistency. Traditionally, we have come with a 2% increase. Generally, that's the average for cost of living over the last 10 years. We know it dips and increases over some years, but again, that's been the traditional average over the past 10 years or so. Some of the major some of the fees that are changing and significant changes to the fee schedule this year are the MZO fee, which I discussed last meeting. Those types of applications, given the experience we have with our other partner authorities, are very complex or time consuming. There's a lot of pre-consultation. The authorities that have established a fee for the MZOs have indicated that they have 100% surcharge, and that's the proposed fee that we're recommending. So there's some consistency there across the province and consistency with the South Nation and the Rideau Valley. The other items I would just note here is the hearing fee is going to be increased over the next 3 years to be on par with the LPAT or the old OMB application fees, as some members have mentioned that that was a priority for ensuring that there's consistency of fees for same types of tribunals. And the other thing I would mention is that we do get a lot of clearance letters that have a short time frame, and so we're charging an extra $100 for any fees that are within the 3 business day window. So that's the summary of A to C. And Angela, if there's anything you want to mention for D, I'll leave it for you.
Matt. Just digital services, that's our largest changes in Schedule D this year. So earlier this year, we had imposed a new fee for producing hydraulic models, hydrogeological models for our engineering team to be able to charge the consultants or developers when providing those. But there's also a fee for producing the reports, whether it be a flat fee for producing digital or hard copies of the reports, and it will allow for staff time to fulfill the requests. So that is consistent with Rideau Valley and South Nation conservation authorities. So we are including that in our Schedule D for reports. Small is $140, up to a large is $405 is what would be consistent with the other conservation authorities. As well, our educational center, since the program has been suspended during the pandemic, we have an opportunity to rent out the education center itself. There's been a few instances where it has been asked for. So we have decided to include a rental fee consistent with our picnic shelter at the Milliken Tail, just because there's no washroom facilities or kitchen facilities within the education center either. So we thought that the same fee would apply for the education center. And as well, we've did some housekeeping. Our rental agreements for when the Milliken Tail site has been rented out for weddings and whatnot, the fees that are always shown in the rental agreements, we've pulled into our Schedule D now for the cloister area for weddings and for staff time. So if there's an event that falls outside of the regular staff hours, working hours, that there is a recovery of $30 per hour for staff time to go to the site afterwards. So that is the changes.
Thanks, you too. I see Phil has a question. Go ahead, Phil.
Yes, just I noticed in the culvert replacement section, the fee goes from $275 if you get with the same dimensions to $650 if you go to a larger diameter. Are we responsible then to judge the engineering on that, or is it just that what's our additional responsibility there if the culvert size is increased, which is of course something we should encourage if you're replacing it?
It all depends, depending on the type of water course, the characteristics. We could be requesting for a hydraulic study, and there's a cost for us to review that. We do try to, especially in the rural areas, we try to, we look upstream and downstream at other crossings, and maybe that culvert has to be increased in size to be consistent with other sizes on the same stretch. So, and often that takes a couple of site visits and dialogue back and forth. So there's a cost to that. So we try to be reasonable, but we need to have cost recovery on these types of applications.
As ever, I don't object to the principle of cost recovery. That's a good one, especially if it comes to the Section 28, but hopefully that's something you can look at in the future. The final question on V's I wanted to ask is the report, generating reports. Are these are reports we already have, or is this something that the Conservation Authority has to prepare? There's a fee, whether it's that's the same whether you produce it digitally or whether you produce a paper copy. And it doesn't sound enough to be something that we would, the Conservation Authority would be doing. It sounds like it's an existing report.
Some of them are our own reports that we've produced, that we've gone for a lot of through a process, for instance, updating the Lower Mississippi. Other requests that we've received are historic stormwater pond reports for prior development that a new developer may be looking for. We have to dig those up. There's a cost to maintaining information and retrieving information and distributing it. So these are consistent with other CAs. We've moved to a new storage and retrieval system in regard to our data. So there's a cost to maintain everything.
I'm not questioning that there shouldn't be a charge. I was hoping you might, as you look at it in the future, encourage people to take the digital report. So there is, I would think it's more difficult to produce the report for them in a paper form, and you're charging the same amount. But anyway, you and your colleagues can work that out. If there's a way of taking the least work, promoting the least work way. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Sally, did you want to add to that? You're on mute, Sally.
I just wanted to pick up on what Matt was saying. There's an inclination to focus on the amount of time to prepare the documentation, be it digital or hard copy, and that the cost should reflect that. But I think what Matt was speaking to is it was the cost to create that document in the first instance and to maintain and update that data set over time, that those costs are intended to capture in part.
Thank you. Faye, go ahead.
I had never noticed before that there was a cost for site plans. Is that like, for instance, if I'll say Beckwith Township and somebody's going to build a garage on and they do a site plan, do you review that site plan? Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Faye. Yes, we do. Like a site plan in regard to the Planning Act. If it's a building permit and it's not in the regulated area, we would not review that. So if it's circulated through the Planning Act and we comment on it based on our agreement, which is in an informal agreement, which is in the regulated area, then yes, there is a cost and it's reflected in the fees because we do a site inspection and we provide a letter and advice.
So the developer himself pays for that then?
That's my understanding, that the townships collect the fee for us, which is we much appreciate. And then they bill the applicant directly.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I don't see any other hands up, so I'm going to move to the suggested motion. Resolved that the Board of Directors approve the 2022 fee schedules as presented in staff report 3166/21. Do I have a mover for this motion? Phil. Seconder, Paul Kehoe. All in favor? Motion is carried. Moving along on the agenda, item number 7, a Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund grant report from Sally.
Okay, so earlier this year, the federal government reached out to Conservation Ontario with an offer to provide funding to Conservation Ontario to administer amongst all the CAs for the purpose of carbon capture and storage on riparian and wetland type areas, as well as some grassland areas as well. And so the call was put out to all the CAs, and I submitted an application in to capture things that we already had in our interim financial plan, or in our capital plan and program. And surprisingly, all three came through, and for not insignificant dollars. So I'm just very quickly going to walk through with you the three projects. So the first one, which is sorry, I lost my page there. The first one is got it here. There we go. The land conservation and acquisition plan. So this came through in part because, as you might recall from my first presentation having to do with the regulatory changes, this was actually something in that consultation document that was circulated earlier this year as going to be a mandatory requirement. So I thought, well, if we're having to do it, and secondly, that our watershed plan that you approved last year says we should do it as well, and what it should look like, then this was an opportunity to get funding from the federal government to support development and delivery of that product. So the land conservation and acquisition plan is a tool that we would use to assess land across both the Mississippi and Carp watersheds, that to identify land that should be protected, either because of the ecological services it provides to us, or for its inherent ecological values, or because of, well, and under the category of ecological services would be flood mitigation or carbon capture. And then if we identify priority lands that are at potential risk or a particular value that we wanted to secure, that these federal funding dollars could be used to support acquisition. The second project has to do with restoration of a section of the Carp River and immediately upstream of the village of Carp. Now, this was a project identified in the Carp River Action Plan and has been on the books for many years, but was lacking funding for moving forward. And so the federal funding that this project will allow us to secure is enabling the project to go forward. The last one is the Alice project, which I've given you a couple of updates on. And this is something that Julie will be speaking to in her presentation on this the stewardship plan. So on the assumption that we are getting the Alice funding, I applied for dollar matching funds from the federal government, and both have come through. So the key element to understand about this federal funding is that it's dollar matching. We only get dollars from the feds based upon the dollars that we've been able to secure. Now, if you go to the table in the report, and I want to make sure this document doesn't jump around on me, you'll see that when I heard that we received a tentative approval to move forward with this in August, I had to immediately pick up the phone and call any number of our potential partners to see whether or not we could secure the matching funds. And so you can see in the table 1 in the report that we have been able to secure a significant amount of money from other partners, such that between the amount that I'm illustrating there are 133 that I'm recommending MVCA commit to. We're leveraging 1.8 million from the feds and 1.6 million from other partners. So it's a tremendous ratio for the amount of commitment I'm asking the board to approve. So the total project value of all of these is 3.8 million. And I really do view this as a very unusual opportunity that's come forward to us. With respect to the 133,000, some of the money under the in-kind is money that effectively the board had already approved, because you had approved that we carry out what I'll call the regulatory components of these projects, or some staffing allocation already as part of our municipal levy. But there are cash components that we would need to fund upfront, largely having to do with legal and surveying costs and that sort of thing around some of these projects. And so one of the key elements underlying this whole project is that in terms of the land conservation and acquisition project, that we would partner with the Mississippi Madawaska Land Trust and the foundation for the purpose of fundraising, and that we would be looking to promote in the community a dollar matching fundraising campaign that would be used to secure our $133,000 contribution. But for cash flow reasons, this report is recommending that we may need to dip into either the Glencairn Reserve or our operating reserve to be able to upfront some costs that we know will be recoverable from the federal government in accordance with their timelines. So the bottom line is, I'm in this report, I'm looking for the board to endorse these projects so that we can enter into an agreement with Conservation Ontario and to direct us to work with the Madawaska Land Trust to undertake this fundraising campaign and to approve interim financing if needed by drawing funds from one of those two reserves. So I will leave it there and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Sally. Getting a little bit of background noise. If you're not speaking, I'm just going to ask folks to close your microphones. And I'm going to put the motion forward before we go into discussion. The suggested motion is resolved that the Board of Directors A, endorse the 3 projects that have received draft approval under the Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund as presented in this report. B, direct staff to work with Mississippi Valley Conservation Foundation and the Mississippi Madawaska Land Trust to develop and implement a fundraising campaign to secure the $133,000 cash contribution by MVCA. And C, approve borrowing of up to $133,000 from the Glencairn Reserve or Operating Reserve, which shall be replenished as monies are donated. Do I have a mover for that motion? Janet, seconded by Faye. And John Carew, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I'll come back to the point that I raised earlier about whether or not we within MVCA have the skill set to do effective fundraising. And it's not just the match funding, it's equally combined with the suggestion in terms of the community liaison position, and perhaps at a more daunting level, what happens with the Mill of Kintail. So I did say that it touched on a number of agenda items, and I'd rather deal with it in summary. So quite honestly, I have over many years watched the MVCA Foundation struggle. And one of the reasons is that the ability of the foundation and the ability of staff who have been asked to work on these types of activities, it's not been a priority and it's been off the side of people's desks. So my real concern is that unless MVCA is really in a better position to perhaps even, as we've done previously, where we've sought out consultants' help, there are consultants who do professional fundraising and who actually know how to put together something that the MVCA fund could actually pick up and run with, rather than trying to do it on its own. And I would say the same of the Land Trust. And I work with a small not-for-profit organization, and even we rely on a professional fundraiser. Doesn't break the bank, and I think it's a smarter way to go forward. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think that's something for the foundation to consider. I know I've been keeping my eye on it for the past little while, and I know it's in the midst of the start of a revival. So I hear those comments. Sally?
Yes, I was just going to say, so we are planning a foundation meeting next week where I'm going to be having that very discussion. The foundation is going through a governance review right now. And in conversations I've had with Mississippi Madawaska Land Trust, it's acknowledged all around that these are huge undertakings. The Land Trust just recently was successful in a Trillium application. So they have 3 staff now to help with fundraising. And there is monies within both organizations to undertake some fundraising consulting work, as well as in the application I submitted to the federal government, there's an allowance to help us undertake this work. So by no means was I thinking that staff alone or staff at MMLT would be having sole responsibility for this. It's a big undertaking.
So I'm encouraged to hear that, Chair. And it really had nothing to do with the approval of the projects. It really had to do with more on the operational side of, please, let's move away from the status quo and get the help we need and increase our chance of success. Thank you.
Those are good comments. Does anyone else have any questions or comments before we move on to the vote? Phil, go ahead. You're on mute.
Yes, that's what you told me to do, and I forgot you said that. I just think we should recognize that staff have done a heck of a good job on this. Conservation Ontario had $9 million to deal with, and Sally has a commitment of something like 3. I can't remember the total amount. It was over 3 million, over a third of it, which is well done for putting all that together. I certainly agree with what John says. Let's augment our skills where we haven't done well in the past, and sometimes it's just I've found that they don't like to ask, and you have to know how to ask, and I'm sure that's what the professionals can put together a program for you. This is such a good deal that I hate people taking money out of the Glencairn Trust, but even if we lost it all, there's probably enough there to make it's a good enough program that it might be worth undertaking. I'm confident, though, that with everybody puts their shoulder to the wheel, we'll do well on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Anyone else? Okay, we'll move to the vote. We've got 3 more items in this meeting, and then we have a short meeting afterwards. So all in favor of the motion before us? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Okay, moving on to item number 8, COVID-19 vaccination policy report 316921. I'm in the understanding we have some legal advice to receive. So I'm going to move. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to move that we move into camera for that presentation, and then we'll move out of camera for the motion and the vote. But we're going to go in for this briefing and any discussion around that matter while we're in there. So I'm going to move that the Board of Directors move in camera session for discussion of advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, and further resolve that Sally McIntyre and Angela Miller remain in the room. That's by me. Do I have a seconder for that motion? John Carreau. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, the motion is carried. So unless you're a member of the board or Sally or Angela, I'm just going to ask you to move out of the meeting, or if the host can move people into a waiting room or while we go in camera. I still see Erica, Julie, and Soba. Erin. Does she have to transfer host over to you, Sally?
We did.
No, she's out. Okay, here we go. Okay, we're in camera. Phil? I see. Is your hand, is that a lingering hand or is that a
Must
new
be-
hand?
Must be a lingering hand, I guess.
Ah, okay. It's legacy hand. Okay, go ahead, Sally.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen.
Oh, I thought it-
Okay, can everybody see that all right?
Yes.
Issues, okay. So for those of you who were in yesterday's Policy and Priorities Committee meeting, I've updated yesterday's PowerPoint to capture the advice of legal counsel and some of what was discussed yesterday. So for those who weren't in that meeting, just some highlights to begin with. The reg came out in late August saying that organizations needed to follow medical officer of health directives regarding the establishment of vaccination policies. In September, on September 7th, the city came out with its mandatory vaccine policy. And I put mandatory in quotation marks because there's, I think, a lot of confusion around what mandatory means. So I'll come back to that. On September 10th, OPG, for whom we do work, issued a letter requiring all employees and contractors to be fully vaccinated and contractors to implement vaccine standards that meet their requirements. And as of September 22nd, people visiting our properties, particularly the Gatehouse and having meetings there, have to be vaccinated. And then on October 12th, all the CAs received a briefing from Hicks Morley, which is a legal firm, on giving us advice just generally in terms of development of policies. And of course, as of this week, everybody can download their vaccine passport, which makes implementation easier. So what came out of that briefing by Hicks Morley earlier this month was that whatever policy you develop, it should follow these key principles, and that it needs to be reasonable, clear, and unequivocal. It needs to obviously be brought to the attention of the employees. Where it's invoked, the employee needs to be given an understanding of what the consequences are, and that we have to implement it consistently. And so there were a lot of different versions of the vaccine policy and circulation, both from our member municipalities and others, as well as amongst the CA community. And I would say over the past 4 weeks, a lot of us sort of got it down to what you see in front of you today. The language may be slightly different between the CAs, but a lot of them have gravitated to what was put forward in the staff report. Now, at yesterday's PNP committee meeting, there was concern regarding references to the code as an eligible exemption. A lot of organizations, but not all by any means, are only identifying that if you have a medical condition that you would be exempted. So as it pertains to the policies in front of you, what the Policy and Priorities Committee was recommending was basically removal of any references to the Human Rights Code or that as a eligible exemption reason. So you can see I've highlighted for you here how that would impact the wording as provided to you. The only reason why I've highlighted that one phrase there, personal, sincerely held religious or creed-based reason, is in subsequent discussions with legal counsel, they wanted us to, if we're going to include this, to simplify that, to just reiterate again, Human Rights Code. So now I'm going to address with you what legal counsel said. So in summary, they said, first off, the board needs to determine what the desired outcome is. Do we want to have vaccination or be vaccinated or be subject to testing? Or do they want vaccinate or the employees dismissed? And it's two very distinct outcomes. And this is where I think the first thing confusion starts around the use of the term mandatory. Because for example, the city of Ottawa provides for testing, and yet it's described generally as being a mandatory policy. It's mandatory, it has all sorts of requirements, but it, oops, I'm sorry, I went back there. But at the end of the day, if a person doesn't get vaccinated, they're not necessarily going to be dismissed unless there are other grounds for dismissal. So it is the recommendation of our legal counsel that we provide for testing as for those who remain unvaccinated. Now, the reason for this is, as I've identified in item 2 there. So first of all, the regulation, it does not require it to be vaccinate or be dismissed. And in fact, it would be considered exceptionally aggressive if we were to implement that kind of policy. And if we were to do that and not have the kind of Ontario Human Rights Code language in the document, that prima facie, legal term, on the face of it, the document would read in a prejudicial kind of fashion, in that unless you're providing for some sort of reason, accommodation, that at face value, without any sort of other information, then it would be considered a discriminatory policy. In the short amount of time I had between yesterday and today with the legal counsel, they weren't able to confirm, but they felt it may also be subject to a charter challenge. And last 2 points is, whatever policy we put in place, we need to be able to defend that it's actually reflective of the workplace risks and that it's needed to protect our workers or the public. And when I think about our workplace and an environment, personally, I'm not convinced that that's the case. We're not, engaged in caring for vulnerable populations. Where people remain unvaccinated, largely they can either work from home, or if they're an outdoors employee, they're outdoors. And they are able to still wear masks and implement all those other measures. So at face value, legal counsel was strongly recommending against a very hard dismissal approach. And then if we were to do that, to recognize that we could be at significant risk. The other reason for including language around whether or not the exemption is arising from a human rights code petition is to address this last matter on the slide, which is, okay, what if we do allow testing? And the question becomes, how do you distinguish between people who had a legitimate reason under the code from those who just, for whatever reason, didn't want to get vaccinated? And so we could have a policy where we make everybody pay, or that MVCA pays for all. But if we're in honoring our requirements under the code to provide accommodation, then a typical accommodation would likely be to pay for the test. And that's what would make the distinction between somebody who has obtained a code exemption versus those who haven't. So I'm just going to continue on here. I'm just going to check my screen though, because I'm seeing that some people, I think somebody may have gone out of the meeting and is trying to get back in. No, I'm not seeing that. Okay, so I'm going to carry on. I keep on getting a ding dong here at my end. So I'm just going to close that out and come back into the presentation. So it's, there we go. Okay, so with that in mind, the policy you have in front of you says the following. It says, that we define everybody that's applicable as employees, and that would include yourselves as board and committee members, all staff, contractors, students, and volunteers, and any new hires. In terms of timing, it's a 3-step approach that we're recommending. Proof of vaccination by the 29th or an exemption letter. And then if you're not able to do that, that you need to obtain your first vaccine by the 12th or an exemption letter. And by the 13th, either you're demonstrating that you're fully vaccinated or you're now going to be subject to mandatory testing. And that's what's mandatory, is that you will have to either vaccinate or you shall be subject to testing. So the policy is written before you. It allows for these two exemptions, either a medical condition or human rights code exemption. And oh, there was that was meant to come out, but in any event, and that you would be subject to twice weekly testing. And the reason why we're recommending this, regardless of whether you're able to work from home, is so that at any given time, we know whether or not you're contagious or whatever. And that if we need you to come into the office, we know what your availability is. All these test results would come to me and be held in confidentially in accordance with, privacy laws. And the element that's not in the report before you is that I think we do need a component in the policy that speaks to who will pay for the testing. And so this ties back to the earlier discussion about legal counsel and why we should have Ontario Human Rights Code referenced in our policy. So I believe that's the last, so I will stop sharing and happy to answer any questions.
So Sally, the options in front of us based on your recommendation are, I believe the report that's with the board package is the original report with the language with respect to creed removed. So that's it. So we have the option of going with what's in front of us plus a recommended amendment with respect to testing, or we have the option of the report as amended by the Policy and Priorities Committee plus an amendment to that deals with accommodation related to exemptions and testing. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay. So we can have the discussions around the advice and how to tool the resolution. And when we're done our discussion, we'll go outside of camera, move the motion that we decide on, and then proceed that way in the open session. So Phil, followed by Faye.
Yes, I think it's prudent to accept legal advice. What I wasn't sure about was the cost of the testing. I saw briefly on the screen something about people we would pay, or is it would it be a fair thing to ask the unvaccinated people pay at least half the cost of the testing? Thank you. That's the only thing I am. I think there's some fairness in putting in asking the presumption that people should get vaccinated. If they're unable to, for other than medical reasons, they shouldn't pay part of the cost of testing. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Faye?
My question is, when you speak of testing, the rapid testing, we get those kits are free, correct? And those are going to be done twice a week to people that aren't vaccinated. But if they have a positive test on that, then they have to get the big test, correct? Can they you have to pay for that to get the big test, or can they just go to the Almont Hospital or wherever and get the test, or is there a fee for that now when you're speaking of that? Because that's what they do at nursing homes. Like,
if I may, Chair, my understanding is that those other tests are free from the province because you're symptomatic, or you've gone through that initial test, and those are free. Like Beckwith Township, MVCA, we can obtain the kits free. It's the cost to do the analytics that's $40 a pop, to my understanding. So, but I can clarify that because to make sure that I've captured that right. But my understanding is it's $40 for the analyses
of the rapid test.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. My brother-in-law, like his wife, is in the nursing home, and he had both his shots, and he would get tested with the rapid kit every time he went in. And one time he tested positive, and they could tell him right away that he wasn't allowed in. And then he had to go the next day and get the big test, and it was negative because he had both shots. But anyhow, that's what I was wondering how fast, if they could tell at the nursing home, I'm sure that you would be able to tell right away there too. Anyhow, it's something to look into.
Absolutely.
John? John Carew?
Thanks, Chair. I guess whenever I hear legal advice, I always wonder how many lawyers have been involved. Because one of the things I'm not clear about, well, I'll tell you what I think I am clear about, and then where I find some confusion. I'm clear with the exemptions for medical reasons. I'm supportive of exemptions where in fact it's in compliance with the Human Rights Code. Where I wasn't quite clear was, and Sally, perhaps I misheard, in that, is there a third exemption? And that is an employee who, for whatever reason, just chooses not to be vaccinated, but because they are working remotely, wearing a mask, or are outside, they could still remain an employee of MVCA and in fact face no disciplinary action whatsoever. And if that is the case, that concerns me.
So to clarify, that is exactly the case. That there is significant concern, and that's why in the slide deck, I said it's either vaccinate or test, or vaccinate or potential dismissal. So if your objective is, as a board, to have mandatory vaccination.
I'm on a call. I just got to finish this call.
That regardless, of whether or not a person has an exemption for medical conditions or under the Human Rights Code, and you are prepared to have me dismiss staff because they haven't been able to fulfill that requirement, that is what the legal counsel is saying would be considered aggressive policy, subject to a potential charter. And we would need to demonstrate that that is a reasonable request given the type of work we perform as an organization and that work that that person performs. So
personally, I would find that an overinterpretation and not something I would be supportive of. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Eli, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill, I think your microphone is on. Thank you, Madam General Manager, about your presentation. Obviously, we're not the only one. We have to have a policy. We have to have a policy, and your policy is no different than any other organization. So I'm not sure how much debate can we do here or how, other than support the steps you're taking, because we have to have a policy in place. That's number one. Now, who pay for the test, or at the end of the day, I'm not sure, and I know this is confidential, but in percentage, how many of our staff double vaccinated or vaccinated, or can you tell? Like, I don't mean number, but percentage wise, do we have issue with staff not vaccinated? And
this is hearsay because we haven't asked staff to declare yet, but I would say that easily 90% of staff are vaccinated, and that the remaining 10% that aren't either have a legitimate medical concern that they're in the process of pursuing with their physician to see whether or not it's an issue and whether they should proceed. But I'm also aware of that there's at least one, possibly two, maybe three people who for other reasons do not want to get vaccinated and may make a claim under the code for an exemption.
Okay, well, they can make the claim. Nobody can stop that. We know that. And we know somebody somewhere, if it's not in this province in Canada, is going to challenge the human right, and which is fine, that too. That's why we have those rules in place. We're not above the law. I'm great. At least you are working toward a policy. Being a board member of the Ottawa Public Health Board, I can tell you, even physician, they will behold very scrutiny about exemption. It's not like, oh, I have a stomach ache, I need a day off, and they write it over that's not going to be the same. We know they're going to be scrutinized. So rest assured, if you have a doctor exemption, that means it is a legit and it's been true. The small amount of staff we're dealing with, obviously it is a concern, but I'm glad we have a policy, and that policy is clear in my mind. It's no different than the city, the OC Transpo, what Faye said, a long-term care or any other organization. But I applaud you for moving forward with the policy, because obviously we have to have that policy in place. I don't know what else to say other than 90% of our staff is a representative of 90% the city, or the majority of the people in this area have been vaccinated. So it's a similar number. So thank you, Sal. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Eli. John Inglis, I saw a yellow hand flashing on you earlier. Were you raising your hand? Okay, I'll go to you, and then I'll go to Bill King.
Thank you. I just want to summarize once again. I'm muddled. I'm a bit confused by all the choices. So does it come down to a choice between accepting a human rights exemption or not accepting a human rights exemption? Is that what we're talking about?
It's a choice between the policy as currently presented, or the policy as amended by the Policy and Priorities Committee at their last meeting, which would lift any reference to the Ontario Human Rights Code out of the policy. That's choice one. And then after that decision is the decision whether to add language with respect to testing, which would have the MVCA cover the cost of testing for people with for lack of a better word, legitimate exemptions based on accepted grounds. And the people who don't have those exemptions and yet remain unvaccinated would bear the cost of the antigen testing. That's the second choice.
So at yesterday's Policy and Priorities Commission, we asked that the human rights reference be lifted, i.e. that only people with a medical exemption could come to work unvaccinated and get tested. I think that's what happened yesterday. Is that right?
It is. It is. And legal counsel has advised us since then against, well, telling us the risks of going in that direction, because it's just, we're required to adhere to the Ontario Human Rights Code as an organization. And whether it's written into the policy or not, but by not writing it into the policy, it could be read that we may be instructing people to ignore the Human Rights Code. And it could be deemed that the policy is prejudiced because it doesn't acknowledge the rights that people have under the Ontario Human Rights Code.
Thank you.
Bill, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if my hand is down yet or not.
It is.
I guess I just wanted to say that my view is if somebody does have a legitimate reason for not getting vaccinated, and by that I mean they cannot get vaccinated, then I think we should pay for it. I think if it's their own choice or any other reason, they should pay for it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Kirby, I saw your hand up earlier. Is it still
Yeah,
up?
I just echoed the same sentiments that before me here by Bill. Same thing. I feel that way. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so I'm just going to canvass everyone here. I'm going to go in reverse order. So with respect to the second proposed amendment, how comfortable are people adding that amendment to the policy that as Bill basically put forward, that if they have a legitimate exemption, the MVCA bears the cost of the testing, and if they don't, they're responsible for paying for the cost of the testing. Is everyone in favor of that? Adding that as an amendment? Most people are. Anyone opposed?
Define legitimate.
Yeah.
Well, according to the policy, so you have a valid medical exemption, or you have an exemption as per the Ontario Human Rights Code.
Mr. Chair, that was the point that I tried to raise.
Yeah.
So, I mean, clearly, I am supportive if the exemptions are human rights code and a medical exemption. Where I got uncomfortable, and I still am, but I won't block this, I will just abstain, is I'm uncomfortable with that third category who come up with their own exemptions based on a personal choice. And I think we're ducking it.
I hear
So-
you.
So.
I hear, yeah.
I'm not there and I'll abstain.
Yeah, I hear you, and that I think that falls into the category of having to manage those individuals based on their ability to do their job, and not adhere to the policy, and that's when other measures click in. If they're unable to do their job because of their vaccination status, attend meetings, go to sites, do their work, that's where other forms of progressive discipline will start to kick in, and that's just part of HR. Krista, go ahead.
Thanks, Jeff. I just wanted to say, John, I appreciate where you're coming from for sure. And personally, I'm right there with you. This is the third policy I've been part of, fourth policy I've been part of the creation of. And I think it would be pretty difficult for us to put something forward without an offer of accommodation for those people who, for whatever reason, are making their decisions the way they're making the decisions. I think what we have in front of us is really consistent with what I'm seeing elsewhere at the county, Mississippi Mills, and a couple other places that I'm part of this. I think where it would really make a big difference is if, we had daycare or we had long-term care, something like that. That's the game changer. But I just wanted to say, I definitely understand where you're coming from, John, but I think we really do need to be able to offer accommodation, whether it's something we agree with personally or not. It would be very difficult for us to have a policy that didn't have that in it. And I think we'd end up having a lot of challenges with that. So anyway, I'll just say I get where you're coming from, John, but I think we've got to go forward with accommodation. Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Krista. And with regard to the matter of the amendment from the Policy and Priorities Committee, are folks looking to move forward with that amendment as recommended by the committee, or reverting back to the original language that includes reference to the Ontario Human Rights Code with reference to CREED and other subsets of the Ontario Human Rights Code not listed, just a general reference to the code? Are people generally comfortable with that, or is there insistence to go with the language recommended by the Policy and Priorities Committee? Kirby?
I'm in favor of that.
Which one?
The one that Jeff just stated.
Keeping reference to the Ontario Human Rights Code?
No.
Or removing it?
Yes.
Okay. Others? Bev, go ahead.
Thank you. I think we have to adhere to the Human Rights Code and the accommodation. I've been a part now of 3 of these, and from my previous life, I just know from these type of policies, if you don't refer to, if you don't respect human rights and accommodation, it'll be challenged and we'll lose it.
Thanks, Bev. Janet, go ahead.
I will accept the inclusion of the Human Rights Code reference, but my vote yesterday was really based on trying to distinguish those who have a legitimate human rights exemption from those who just don't want to get vaccinated. And I realize that that's going to be a judgment call. And if we accept that, and if we accept that there will have to be a way to deal with that, which is that they have to pay for their own tests, and how, Sally, you're going to distinguish between those with a human rights exemption and, I don't want to get vaccinated, and so you're going to pay for the test. I don't know how you're going to do that, but if that's what we're saying, I can vote for that. Thank you.
Sally, go ahead.
I'll just say that I would have to seek legal counsel. If I receive letters requesting exemptions, I will be
Yeah.
seeking legal counsel to see whether they make the tests of the law.
Okay, well, listening to the discussion, I think the motion that I'm going to put forward in open session is to approve the mandatory vaccination policies contained in the staff report today, which includes reference to the Ontario Human Rights Code, and add wording with respect to distribution of antigens and who pays for it, which is the MVCA will distribute rapid antigen tests to staff, board, committee members, volunteers, or students who are required to participate in regular testing. Those who are unvaccinated for reasons other than Clause 8A and Clause B will be required to cover any costs associated with the tests. The MVCA will cover the cost of testing for all others. Is the motion that I'm suggesting we put forward. Is everyone in favor of that? If you are, raise your hands.
Mr. Chair, I don't think we should take a vote in camera, but it's up to you.
Yeah, I'm really just, this is so I can see where we're at. And I'm comfortable bringing that motion forward. So we'll vote on it. We'll move it and vote on it in open session.
So I move we out of camera.
Thank you. You're one step ahead of me. Seconder for the motion to move out of camera. Janet, all in favor? Okay, we're back in open session.
I just have some people waiting in
Yeah.
the waiting room, if I could just let them in.
Okay. And I'm seeing that it's 3:04 on my clock, so we'll try to get through the rest of the meeting as quickly as we can.
And Erin, if I could just ask for you to resume the recording, or it looks like you already have, you're ahead of me. Thank you so much.
Okay, moving on to item number 8 on the agenda, I have a recommended motion. The recommended motion is resolved that the Board of Directors approve the mandatory COVID-19 vaccination policy as contained in Staff Report 3169/21, and 2, add the following wording to the above noted policy. The MVCA will distribute rapid antigen tests to staff, board, committee members, volunteers, and students who are required to participate in regular testing. Those who are unvaccinated for reasons other than Clause 8A or Clause 8B will be required to cover any costs associated with the tests. The MVCA will cover the cost of testing for all others. Could I have a mover for that motion, please? Moved by Chuck Riegelhoff, seconded by Bev Holmes. Is there any further any discussion on the motion? Any discussion? Okay, all in favor, please raise your hands. Opposed? Abstentions? One abstention. The motion carries. Okay, I'm going to move on to item 9, which is the last item for this agenda, which is the Nature Smart client, the stewardship plan report. I have Julie Falsetti, who's been patiently waiting through the meeting to do a presentation. Julie, I'm going to ask you to compress your report and make it tight because we are running a bit over time.
I've already deleted a few things, don't worry.
Delete a few more. I'm
Okay,
kidding.
I'll be very quick. Just gonna share my screen. All right. Great, thank you for having me. I'm Julie. I was hired in June to fill the position of stewardship technician, and I've been working on this stewardship plan since then with guidance and support from Sally. The 2020 interim financial plan made a recommendation for the development and implementation of a 3-year stewardship program. As well, the Mississippi River Watershed Plan prescribed the development of this program. And as did, the stewardship plan also aligns with the corporate strategic plan in that it supports goal number 2 of community building. The stewardship plan has 3 main goals. First goal being to maintain, enhance, and restore natural features so that surrounding communities can benefit from the ecological services they provide. The second goal is to mitigate the impacts of climate change and pressures from urban and rural sediment, the latter of which include forest fragmentation, impacts to surface and groundwater quality, fragmentation and loss of habitat, wetlands, and natural areas, and the introduction and spread of invasive species. And the last goal is to engage communities and landowners in improving public land and privately owned land. To streamline program delivery, the MVCA jurisdiction was divided into 3 distinct regions based on geographic and land use characteristics. So we've got the upper watershed, the middle watershed, and the lower watershed. Program elements will be tailored to meet the different priorities and pressures of each region. So the tables on these next few slides identify the regional objectives and the proposed program focus. And there is quite a bit of overlap between the 3 regions. So all of the text in white are the program elements that are consistent across all 3 regions, and the ones highlighted in blue are the ones that are unique to the individual regions. And you'll see that the septic reinspection program is a program element specific to the upper watershed as well as the middle watershed. As we move northeast in the jurisdiction, rural settlement and agricultural land use is more prevalent as the soils become more fertile. So habitat loss and that is associated with that trend will be addressed with the introduction of an ALICE program, as Sally mentioned earlier, for Lanark County. And this program aims to recruit farmers to restore shorelines, wetlands, grasslands, and pollinator habitat on their marginal farmland. Lower watershed faces significantly more urban and rural settlement pressures, as well as agricultural land use. And the effects of these pressures on water quality will be targeted with Ottawa Rural Clean Water Program, the City Stream Watch Program, volunteer stream cleanup events, as well as identifying opportunities for river and stream restoration and promotion of LIDs. And pressures on local habitat in the lower watershed will be mitigated with Ottawa Rural Clean Water Program again, and the ALICE program, which should be delivered in Lanark County as well as in the Carp watershed. And MVCA also plans to identify opportunities for habitat enhancement projects on public lands, and will undertake invasive species management using data from City Stream Watch and volunteer efforts. This slide shows what the seasonal delivery of each program element will look like. Typically, program promotion outreach takes place in the winter. On the ground delivery takes place from late spring to late fall. And then the end of the year will be spent reporting on the season's accomplishments. Stewardship program will be implemented in partnership with our fellow CAs, most importantly RVCA and South Nation, along with our member municipalities, ALICE Canada, and local agricultural organizations will be engaged for promoting the ALICE program, as well as for populating the partnership advisory committee that goes along with the ALICE program. And we'll also be working with local stewardship-oriented NGOs and not-for-profits, and as well as academia. And the costs of this program will be supported through a few different avenues. Staff will be seeking external funding through grant applications. Several of our partnerships involve financial support, an example being the Ottawa Rural Clean Water Program through the City of Ottawa, and the ALICE program will be supported through ALICE Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada. But the key takeaway is that there will be no budget pressure associated with the pilot program. And I'm happy to take any questions. That was quick enough.
Thanks for that, Julie. I'm sorry to make you rush. We enjoyed a much thorough version of your report of the P&B committee yesterday. And I saw Sally's note in the chat that among the other contributing groups include the Friends of the Carp and Ducks Unlimited should be added to that as well.
Friends of the Carp River.
Friends of the Carp River, not just the carp. Okay,
No,
John,
I see the Carp Hills.
okay, John Carroll, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Chair. I agree with those. I would just add that we also talked yesterday about updating it so that from the objectives point of view, we also mentioned the best management practices that staff provides through the regulatory program. And congratulations, Julie. I think it's really coming together and it will serve us well.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Does anyone else have any questions or comments for Julie? Okay, good. Thank you very much, Julie. Okay, the next item on our agenda is a motion to adjourn before moving into a source water protection meeting. Thanks for lasting this long, folks. Could I have a motion to adjourn the MVCA board meeting, please? Kirby Thompson, seconded by Bill King. All in favor? Thank you very much. I'm going to move over into the source protection meeting. Just need to shuffle my stack of papers here. Aaron, could you start us out with a roll call, please? Although I'm counting 11 or 12 in the room. Actually, can you just do the roll call based on who you see on the camera? We'll move straight into the agenda. Okay, you've received the package. There's an agenda with 2 items on the agenda. Could I have a motion to adopt the agenda, please? Moved by Kirby Thompson, seconded by John Carreau. All in favor of adopting the agenda? Thank you. The agenda is adopted. We have the minutes from the previous source protection meeting from September the 15th, which have also been circulated. Could I have a motion to adopt the minutes from that meeting? Moved by Bev Holmes, seconded by Bill King. All in favor of adopting the minutes? Motion is carried. Okay, we have a report with respect to a recommendation. We have a recommendation that the Mississippi Valley Source Protection Authority officially appoint Roy Hoodle to represent the public sector on the Mississippi Rideau Source Protection Committee. And do I have anybody here? Laura Cummings, are you here? Did you want to give us a quick presentation on that? Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I don't have to translate or anything. I'll be brief. So like you said, the purpose of the report is to obtain approval from the SPA to appoint this new member to our Source Protection Committee. Ontario Regulation 28807 under the Clean Water Act outlines the framework for source protection, for how the Source Protection Committee operates, the number of members, the appointment process, etc. So committees were tasked with creating a source protection plan during the early years of the source protection program, and now they oversee the program with a variety of local interests being represented. So our committee has a total of 12 members with an even membership split between the economic, municipal, and environment /health/ public sectors. During the spring of this year, a member representing the public sector resigned from our committee. So staff began recruitment for a new member in the late spring, early summer. Advertisement for this vacancy of 1 public sector seat was placed in newspapers, on social media, and on our website with a closing date of July 5th, 2021. And interviews were conducted last month and a successful candidate was chosen. So as a result, we are recommending Roy Hoodle be appointed for a term of 5 years to the Mississippi Rideau Source Protection Committee.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Are there any questions or comments for Laura? I know Janet and I took part in those interviews, and I can tell you that we were very impressed with Mr. Hoodle's presentation, and in fact contributed to this recommendation.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, we'll go on to the motion. Resolved that the MVC Source Protection Authority officially appoint Roy Hoodle to represent the public sector on the Mississippi Rideau Source Protection Committee. Do I have a mover, please? Faye Campbell, seconded by Phil Sweetnam. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hands. Motion is carried. Next item is to adjourn this meeting of the Source Water Protection Authority. Kirby Thompson, seconded by Bev Holmes. All in favor of going to adjournment? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, folks, for sticking through the long
Jeff.
process today. There was a lot done. We'll see you at the next meeting in December. And one thing I would like to ask, just quickly ask folks about, if you could provide some feedback by email, is now that we have a COVID-19 policy for the authority, and as things are opening up, I just want to gauge the comfort level of people to with respect to either the December meeting or sometime in December organizing, having an in-person event. If it's possible to hold the meeting in the boardroom itself at the MVCA, working with staff, just to let us know if you're comfortable or if you're uncomfortable with that, just so staff can plan that meeting. As things are opening up, it may be possible for us to actually gather for that meeting, or organize the December lunch that we've missed, so we can actually see each other again.
You have to
Something
wear
different.
your new
Thanks, Jeff.
OCR card?
Hey, just get it tattooed on your forehead, Phil.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, okay.
Will we send that to Aaron or to Sally?
Send it to Sally.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thank you
Okay,
very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good
Get
afternoon.
outside, enjoy the
Bye-bye.
weather.
All
Yeah.
right.
Take care.
Bye.
Sally, I'll send you my summary of all the amendments and stuff.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
Bye-bye.